Ever wondered what condemned prisoners choose to eat before their execution? Could you imagine facing your final meal on death row? Number 13. Ted Bundy, the rejected Last Supper. Ted Bundy, one of America's most notorious serial killers, declined a special last meal before his execution in Florida's electric chair on January 24, 1989. Instead, he was served the standard last meal that Florida prisons offered at the time: steak cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk and juice. However, Bundy refused to eat any of it. The man who had confessed to murdering at least 30 young women across multiple states in the 1970s chose to face his final moments without indulging in a last culinary pleasure. Prison officials noted that Bundy appeared anxious and distracted in his final hours, perhaps too preoccupied with his impending death to think about food. His rejection of the meal has been interpreted by some as a final act of control by a man who had manipulated and controlled his victims. Others suggest it might have been a sign of remorse or acceptance of his fate. Regardless of his reasons, Bundy's decision to forego his last meal has become almost as famous as his heinous crimes, representing a chilling footnote to one of America's most disturbing criminal cases. Number 12. John Wayne Gacy, the fast food finale. John Wayne Gacy, infamously known as the Killer Clown, requested a feast from KFC before his execution by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Gacy's final meal consisted of a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. The choice seemed oddly ordinary for a man who had led such an extraordinary double life: respected community member by day, murderer by night. Gacy had been convicted of killing 33 young men and boys, burying most of them in the crawl space beneath his Chicago home. Before his arrest, Gacy had often performed as a clown at children's parties, adding an extra layer of horror to his crimes. His choice of KFC, a common, everyday American meal, struck many as strangely mundane. Prison officials reported that Gacy ate every bit of his meal, seemingly untroubled by what awaited him hours later. Some psychological analysts have suggested that his choice of comfort food might have been an attempt to reconnect with normalcy in his final hours, or perhaps a reflection of the banality that often underlies evil. The contrast between the ordinariness of fried chicken and the extraordinariness of Gacy's crimes continues to disturb those who study the case. Number 11. Victor Feguer, the single olive statement. In what might be the most minimalist last meal in execution history, Victor Feguer requested a single olive with the pit still in it for his last meal before being hanged in Iowa in 1963. Feguer had been convicted of kidnapping and murder after abducting a doctor from Illinois and killing him in Iowa. His unusual request has become legendary in the annals of last meals. After his execution, the olive pit was found in his suit pocket, leading many to believe that Feguer hoped it would grow into an olive tree from his grave, a symbol of peace and rebirth after his death. Whether this was truly his intention or simply a story that developed afterward remains uncertain. Feguer's execution was the last federal execution in the United States until 2001 and the last one in Iowa. His choice was remarkable for its simplicity and symbolism, standing in stark contrast to the elaborate final meals requested by many other death row inmates. The single olive has become a powerful image in discussions about capital punishment, representing either the futility of seeking meaning in death or the human capacity for hope even at the very end of life. President John F. Kennedy had an opportunity to grant Feguer clemency but declined to do so, making the symbolism of the olive traditionally associated with peace all the more poignant. Number 10. Timothy McVeigh, the sweet goodbye. Timothy McVeigh, executed for the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, chose an unusual last meal: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. McVeigh's bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was, at the time, the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. His simple dessert choice stood in stark contrast to the magnitude of his crime. McVeigh was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001, at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution was the first federal execution in the United States since 1963. Prison officials reported that McVeigh ate his ice cream with apparent enjoyment and showed no remorse in his final hours. Some speculated that his choice of mint chocolate chip, a flavor associated with childhood and innocence, might have been a final attempt to connect with simpler times before his radicalization. Others saw it as further evidence of McVeigh's emotional detachment, choosing comfort food rather than a meal that might reflect the gravity of his situation. Whatever his reasons, the image of the Oklahoma City bomber enjoying ice cream before his execution created a disturbing juxtaposition that many found difficult to reconcile with the horror of his crime. Number 9. Aileen Wuornos, the coffee refusal. Aileen Wuornos, whose story was dramatized in the film Monster, declined a special last meal before her execution by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Instead, she simply asked for a cup of coffee. Wuornos had been convicted of killing 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990, whom she claimed had raped or attempted to rape her while she was working as a prostitute. Her case garnered significant media attention, not only for the nature of her crimes, but also for her troubled life history and her status as one of few female serial killers. On her final day, Wuornos appeared agitated and paranoid, consistent with her behavior throughout much of her incarceration. Her simple request for coffee and nothing else seemed to reflect her desire to remain alert and aware until the very end. In her final statement, Wuornos claimed she would return like Independence Day with Jesus, adding a strange, apocalyptic tone to her execution. The starkness of her last meal request, just coffee, has been interpreted by some as a reflection of the starkness of her life, which had been marked by abuse, abandonment, and hardship from an early age. Others see it as a final act of defiance, refusing to participate in the ritual of the last meal. Number 8. Ronnie Lee Gardner, the Lord of the Rings Marathon. Ronnie Lee Gardner, executed by firing squad in Utah in 2010, made one of the more unusual final meal requests in recent history. Gardner asked for steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up, but with an unusual twist, he wanted to eat it while watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Gardner had been convicted of murder during a courthouse escape attempt in 1985, killing an attorney in the process. His execution was notable for being the last use of a firing squad in the United States to date. Prison officials granted his food requests but denied the movie marathon, citing prison regulations. Some saw Gardner's elaborate meal and entertainment request as an attempt to delay his execution or to create a sense of normalcy in his final hours. Others interpreted his choice of The Lord of the Rings, a story about a long, difficult journey culminating in redemption, as having personal significance for Gardner, who had expressed remorse for his crimes while on death row. Gardner's last meal has become a notable example of how modern death row inmates sometimes request experiences, not just food, in their final hours, reflecting a desire to connect with the outside world one last time before execution. Number 7. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the humble choice. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, executed in 1936 for the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's baby son, requested a simple last meal of celery, olives, chicken, French fries, buttered peas, cherries, and a slice of cake. The Lindbergh kidnapping had been called the crime of the century, and Hauptmann's trial was a media spectacle that captured international attention. Despite maintaining his innocence until the end, Hauptmann was electrocuted at New Jersey State Prison. His modest meal choice stood in contrast to the sensational nature of his case. Some historians have noted that his selection included foods that would have been considered somewhat upscale during the Great Depression, possibly reflecting his German origins and taste. The Lindbergh case had dramatically changed American life, leading to the federal kidnapping law known as the Lindbergh Law and contributing to the creation of the FBI as we know it today. Throughout his imprisonment, Hauptmann had insisted that he was being framed, and some modern analysts have questioned whether he received a fair trial amid the media frenzy. His straightforward last meal, neither extravagant nor particularly symbolic, has largely been overshadowed by the continuing controversies surrounding his guilt or innocence in one of America's most notorious crimes. Number 6. Gary Gilmore, The Final Feast. Gary Gilmore, whose execution in 1977 ended a 10-year moratorium on the death penalty in the United States, requested a last meal of a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, a few cups of coffee, and 3 shots of whiskey. Prison officials granted his food requests but denied him alcohol. Gilmore had been convicted of murdering 2 men in Utah and famously insisted on his execution, refusing appeals and telling the state to just do it, a phrase that later became an iconic slogan for Nike, though with no connection to Gilmore. His execution by firing squad was the first in the modern era of capital punishment in America following the Supreme Court's reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Norman Mailer later chronicled Gilmore's life and death in the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song. Gilmore's last meal request, with its demand for alcohol, reflected his rebellious nature and determination to face his execution on his own terms. His case sparked national debate about capital punishment and whether a condemned prisoner should have the right to waive appeals. In choosing relatively simple American comfort food burgers and potatoes, alongside his denied request for whiskey, Gilmore's last meal embodied both submission to the system and a final attempt to assert control over it. Number 5. Ricky Ray Rector, The Saved Dessert. Perhaps one of the most poignant last meal stories belongs to Ricky Ray Rector, who ordered a steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie before his 1992 execution in Arkansas. Rector, who had shot himself in the head after killing a police officer, had effectively given himself a partial lobotomy, significantly impairing his cognitive abilities. In what became a famous and disturbing anecdote, Rector reportedly saved his pecan pie for later, not comprehending that there would be no later after his execution. This incident became widely cited in debates about executing mentally impaired prisoners. Rector's execution also gained political significance when then-Governor Bill Clinton, in the midst of his presidential campaign, returned to Arkansas to oversee it, seemingly to demonstrate his toughness on crime. The image of Rector saving his pie for after his execution has become a powerful symbol in arguments against executing individuals with diminished mental capacity. The Supreme Court would later rule in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, that executing intellectually disabled individuals constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, though this came too late for Rector. His last meal, particularly the uneaten pecan pie, continues to haunt discussions about capital punishment and mental competency in the American justice system. Number 4. Allen Lee Davis, The Lobster Feast. Allen Lee Davis, executed in Florida in 1999, ordered an elaborate last meal that included lobster tail, fried potatoes, half a pound of fried shrimp, 6 ounces of fried clams, half a loaf of garlic bread, and 32 ounces of A&W root beer. Davis had been convicted of the brutal murders of a pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters in 1982. His execution became controversial for reasons beyond his extravagant seafood feast. He was the first person executed in Florida's new electric chair, built to accommodate his 350-pound frame, and witnesses reported seeing blood on his shirt during the execution, sparking debates about whether electrocution constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The size and richness of Davis's last meal seemed to reflect his physical stature and perhaps a desire for one final indulgence before death. Some commentators noted the irony of his extensive seafood order, given that Florida, surrounded by ocean, was the site of his crimes and execution. In 2000, partly due to the controversies surrounding Davis's execution, Florida switched to lethal injection as its primary method of execution. His last meal, excessive and indulgent, has become emblematic of the tradition of granting condemned prisoners a final feast, regardless of the gravity of their crimes or the suffering of their victims. Number 3. Carla Faye Tucker, The Humble Peach. Karla Faye Tucker, executed in Texas in 1998, requested a surprisingly modest last meal: a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Tucker had been convicted of killing 2 people with a pickaxe during a 1983 break-in, but her case became internationally known because of her gender. She was the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, and her religious conversion while in prison. Her simple, healthy last meal choice seemed to reflect the transformed person she claimed to be after her conversion to Christianity. Tucker's case attracted support from an unusual coalition, including the Pope and televangelist Pat Robertson, who asked for clemency based on her redemption behind bars. Then Governor George W. Bush denied clemency, and Tucker faced her execution with a serenity that impressed even prison officials. Her last meal of fresh fruit and salad stood in stark contrast to both her violent crime and to the typically heartier, comfort food choices of many condemned prisoners. Some saw her meal selection as further evidence of her spiritual transformation, choosing simple, life-sustaining foods rather than indulgent fare. Tucker's execution and her humble last meal continue to be referenced in discussions about redemption, gender in the justice system, and the purpose of capital punishment. Number 2. Adolf Eichmann, the simple red wine. Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, requested a bottle of Carmel, a dry red Israeli wine, as his last meal before his execution in Israel in 1962. Eichmann had been captured by Mossad agents in Argentina in 1960, having escaped Europe after World War II. His trial in Jerusalem was televised worldwide and became a landmark event in confronting the horrors of the Nazi regime. Eichmann's choice of an Israeli wine as his final drink struck many as peculiar given his role in orchestrating the transport of millions of Jews to death camps. He drank about half the bottle before being hanged shortly after midnight on June 1, 1962. Eichmann was the only person ever executed by the State of Israel through civilian courts. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea beyond Israel's territorial waters to prevent his grave from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. The symbolic significance of a Nazi war criminal consuming a product of the Jewish state in his final hours has been subject to countless interpretations. Was it a final acknowledgement of defeat? A last attempt to appear civilized? Or simply the choice of a man who had developed a taste for local wine during his imprisonment? Whatever his reasons, Eichmann's last drink remains one of history's most layered and controversial final meal selections. Number 1. James Edward Smith, the Cosmic Last Request. James Edward Smith, executed in Texas in 1990, made one of the strangest last meal requests in history: a lump of dirt, which he claimed he wanted for a voodoo ritual. Prison officials denied this request and instead gave him a cup of yogurt. Smith had been convicted of murdering a cashier during a robbery in 1983. As a practicing Wiccan, Smith's unusual request reflected his spiritual beliefs. According to some accounts, he wanted the dirt specifically to perform a ritual that would allow his spirit to return to life. The denial of his request highlights the limitations placed on last meals. While many prisons attempt to accommodate reasonable food requests, items that might pose security concerns or have religious magical purposes often face rejection. Smith's case raises interesting questions about religious freedom in the context of death row. While Christians are typically granted access to clergy and communion before execution, practitioners of less mainstream religions may find their final spiritual requests denied. The substitution of yogurt for dirt created a surreal footnote in the history of capital punishment, simultaneously trivial and profound. Smith's request and its denial underscores how the ritual of the last meal operates within strict institutional boundaries, even as it purports to offer condemned prisoners a final choice and a moment of autonomy before their execution. Ever considered what your own last meal might be if faced with such a grim situation? What does a person's final food choice reveal about their life, their crimes, or their state of mind as they face their end?